Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Goodwin of Key Performance Ideas, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Oracle Hyperion Planning, Predictive Planning Overview, version 11.123, presented today by Ed Apuy. Ed is a certified Oracle Hyperion S-Base and planning professional. He has a vast experience in providing solutions for companies in a variety of industries. His software expertise includes the Hyperion EPM suite, Planning, S-Base, HFM, FDM, BI Plus Reporting Suite, Oracle Data Integrator, and Hyperion Application Link. A results-oriented individual, Ed has proven to deliver client success through his strong analytical skills. Thank you, Ed, for joining us today.
Thanks, Anissa. Hello, everyone. Today's meeting is to go over the predictive planning feature in the Oracle Hyperion Planning Suite. Today's agenda is going to cover what is predictive planning, its features, some of the installation prerequisites, application deployment requirements, dimensionality requirements, how does the process work. We'll get into form design requirements, and then we'll go through the steps to run a prediction. And then finally, we'll close with a Q&A segment. So starting with, what is predictive planning? It is a simulation, forecasting, and risk analysis tool for spreadsheet planning users. It is an extension to SmartView, so you're not necessarily installing a separate program, but an add-in to Excel. It allows users to predict performance based on historical information, and it uses sophisticated time series and other statistical techniques to confirm and validate predictions. Now let's go over predictive planning's main features. It has a graphical interface. It offers integration with SmartView and HSF. HSF is the Hyperion Strategic Finance product. It works on both 32-bit and 64-bit environments for both the operating system and Microsoft Office. It is Excel-based, which makes it easy to learn and use. From a reporting and data extraction side, reports and data extracts are pretty easy to generate. Moving on to the installation prerequisites, first and foremost, you'll need SmartView client installed. Once you have SmartView installed, you can download the predictive planning add-in by logging into Workspace, opening planning, going into the Tools menu, then install, and then selecting the predictive planning add-on, as you can see in my screen. Now, the prerequisite is you need a deployed planning application, of course, as you have to point the prediction against an existing application, and you'll need data, of course, as your source of your analysis. From a user side, at a minimum, from a security standpoint, you'll need the role of planner and ad hoc security. To confirm that the add-in has been installed properly, you can go into SmartView Options Extensions and then check that the add-in has been successfully deployed, as you can see in my screen here. Moving on to the application deployment requirements. I think from an app deployment perspective, there aren't any special requirements to enable this feature. I think that most applications that feature standard dimensions like accounts, time, entity, scenario, version, in addition to custom DEMS, let's say cost center, department, region, etc., should really have no trouble using this feature. From a dimensionality perspective, so scenario and version are required dimensions in planning, and they're going to help you define data sources that will be part of the prediction model. Scenario and version are required, again, in planning, so this is not necessarily extra overhead. From a naming convention perspective, you do have some flexibility to use the names that best fit your business process. For the purposes of this presentation, I went with names that I thought were the most descriptive. So how does it work? Predictive planning works by comparing intersections of scenario inversion. There are three types of data sources that are part of the process. So first, you have the source of the analysis. In this case, we're going to go with actual final as our source of the analysis. Next, you have the target of the analysis, and that's going to be the scenario target against which the prediction will run, along with versions that will store the best case, base case, and worst case predictions. As an added feature, it's not required, but it's kind of an optional feature. You can define a third intersection of scenario version so that a comparison can be made between the prediction output and your numbers. Moving on to the form requirements. There are some minor nuances to the forms. At this time, not every form works with this feature, only simple forms. So let's go over some of the basic requirements. So you need to have a series axis. That would be the rows on the form that require one or more non-time dimensions, such as accounts or entities. You'll also need a time axis. That would be the columns, where you can have a combination of year and or period. There is some flexibility with scenario inversion, as those dimensions are permitted on either time series or the series axis. Now, the form needs to have some data, and it must not be ad hoc. A final note on this, the predictive planning feature is smart enough not to display the interface if the form displayed or used does not meet the minimum requirements. So now let's switch gears and get into running an actual prediction. So as a first step, first of all, you need to start with some data, right? So as a rule of thumb, I think that the more data, the better, as it will improve the accuracy and quality of the predictions. In addition, predictive planning will detect seasonality, produce interpolated values, and also normalize outlier values. So as you can see on my screen, I went with a pretty simple input template here to load our baseline information. So we have 2012 actuals. That's going to be our source. And then we have 2013 plan. That's going to be our comparison point. Moving on to step 2. You need to create a form that meets the design requirements that we just covered. And then once predictive planning detects a form that meets the basic requirements, it will unhide the predict button in the planning tab in Excel. Once you click on the predict button, it will then unhide the toolbar that you can see at the bottom of my screen. And then to get started with actually running the process, we need to go through a series of configuration steps that we can get into by clicking on the Set Up Data Form button. So once you do that, it's going to take you to this configuration screen. And the first tab is the Data Source tab. That's where you define the planning application and the ranges of data to be used as the source of the analysis. Next tab is the Map Names tab. That's where you define the scenario version intersections that will serve as the data sources. Like I mentioned before, we're using actual final as the historical data source. We have plan final as our comparison data source. And lastly, we're using forecast as the target of the prediction with specific versions labeled as base case, worst case, and best case. As I said before, you do have some flexibility to label the scenarios and versions with whichever naming convention that best fits your process. Notice at the bottom of the screen here, there's an option to automatically paste the results of the prediction onto the data form. I find this extremely useful, as the alternative method to do so requires additional clicks. As you're going to see later, while predictive planning will auto-populate the form, it will not submit the data to the database. You will have a chance to review it or spot check it before actually submitting it. Moving on to the next tab, that's the member selection tab, and here's where you define the prediction type or prediction method. The first one is bottoms up. I think this is the one that will be used the most, and this is for predictions to be written at the lowest level members on the form. Now, this, of course, requires the results to be aggregated to a summary level for reporting and analysis. The next method is the top-down method, and that's for predictions to be written at the summary level members of the form. Now, that requires the results to be pushed down to a lower level of detail, either via calculation or by designing a top-down application. The third method is the full method, and that one implies that predictions will be written at all levels, so regardless of their hierarchy level. So I like the variety of choices here. As you can see, there's a method pretty much for every type of application. Lastly, we have the Options tab, and here you have some additional features to detect seasonality, choose from a variety of prediction and statistical methods. You can define your own prediction intervals, and you can also override the prediction periods from the form. Once you're done with the configuration, you click on Predict, verify the settings, and then run the prediction. Once you do that, voila, you end up with a form that's now populated with data, as you can see, all across your time periods. Notice that the cell coloration indicates that the data has not been submitted to the application yet. So at this point, you have the luxury to review your numbers, analyze them, adjust them if necessary, and then finally submit them to the application. Predictive planning has a number of features on the reporting side that are pretty handy. So chart generation, graphs, reports, and export data to a file if you wish to maybe feed it to a some kind of downstream system or output. And then, of course, you can rerun the process as often as necessary. So if some of your baseline information changes, or some of your drivers or metrics change, or you decide to maybe tweak the numbers a little bit, you can, of course, rerun this ad hoc as often as necessary. Lessons learned. Using this trend-based analytic is very powerful. However, organizations should consider how to deploy it and where it is appropriate to be utilized. I think it's going to represent a paradigm shift between the current bottom-up use of planning versus using this new predictive planning technology. I think personally, it's a great tool for reoccurring expenses, such as travel, meals, entertainment. I think with regards to revenue or workforce planning that are a little bit more volatile, I think some additional design, and logic may be required. But it is definitely an excellent tool for creating bottoms-up baseline information with, again, the ability to tweak it if needed. So I'm going to close my segment with an important note, right? So I think we all must strategically consider, how existing processes will need to be modified in order to apply this new technology optimally. So with that last thought, Vanessa, I'm going to pass it back to you so that we can start the Q&A segment.
Thank you, Ed. To ask a question, go to Viewing Desktop at the top of your screen and select Chat to ask Ed a question. In the meantime, while everyone takes a moment to enter their questions, Ed, I have a question for you. Several of my clients have asked me, does this work against composite forms?
That's a great question, Anissa. Actually, it does not at this point. At least in its current stage, it depends on a simple form. It does not support composite forms yet at this moment. Okay,
I have another question coming. I actually have a few, so I'll take them one at a time. Can you run predictive planning in Workspace?
That's another good question. Actually, you cannot. Again, as of today, you cannot run this in Workspace. So you do need to download the predictive planning add-in and install it, in addition to SmartView. So this is all Excel-based at this point.
Okay, let's see. The next one, do I need additional server hardware to use predictive planning?
You do not. So you can leverage your existing hardware. If you are using planning, that means you have a dedicated server to planning and S-Base and your existing modules. So no, it does not require any additional investment on the server hardware side or any additional server client configuration. So really all you need is an existing instance of planning, and all you need is to download the add-in. That's it.
Is predictive planning a new feature rolled out with 11.121? And this is a continuation of the question I just asked.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. To my knowledge, the earliest release in which predictive planning was available is 11.122. So if I heard correctly, if I heard 11.121, I think, unfortunately, you're right at the borderline. So if you upgrade to either 11.122 or the latest release, which is 11.123, then you can take advantage of this feature, along with some other very nice features that have been rolled out with the latest version.
Here's another question, Ed. How would you submit the best case or worst case scenario to your budget?
Good question. So up front, you would create the necessary versions to support those submissions, right? So if you're, let's say, if we're talking about the forecast, and the forecast is one of your scenarios, then you would create the necessary buckets in your version dimension. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to call them, best, base, worst. You could, call them, draft 1, draft 2, final, or use any nomenclature that makes sense. But at a minimum, you need one version number for each data stream, right? And then once you have that, then during the configuration, you can map the output to the specific version buckets, right? And then you can either use the feature to auto-populate the form, or there is also a mechanism that allows you to to copy and paste the data into the form. But like I mentioned before, that requires